Hi, today we're going to talk about baker's percent, which is the foundation for every single formula that any baker would be using. So if you're going to be baking at home, it's also applicable for you to understand what is the baker's percent. A lot of people call their formulas recipes, but they're actually formulas. They are exact ratios that create a consistency for each and every time you make it. So once you do have the formula set and secure, it's going to be very few variables that it will change once you've done that. And when you do that, you will consistently make the same bread each and every time. It's not a guesswork anymore. That's why we call these formulas. So when we are talking about baker's percent, and you may have heard this term as this before, it is unique to actually baking. And it is based 100% on flour. Okay, so flour on the basis of it is going to be as 100%. And that can be broken up into multiple flours that will total up to 100. So in other words, if you have, let's say 70% is going to be white flour, 20% whole wheat, 10% rye, and the total being 100%. Each of those components are going to be as is, that's 70, 20, 10, but they're going to be totaled against 100%. And then each and every ingredient that is subsequent to that, the water, the salt, the yeast, if you have eggs, if you have oil, if you have sugars, all of those are based against that 100%. As we go through these examples, I will be showing on screen the numbers that I'm going to be speaking about. And when you do this, you can pause, write down the numbers as such, and then I'm also going to provide a link at the end of the video that will actually show much of what it is that I'm talking about. So today, just in the beginning, what I want to do is just go through a very, very simple formula that is going to be flour, water, salt, and yeast, and that is going to be what I would just call a simple formula. Okay, so a simple baker's percent. Once we go through the simple baker's percent, I want to start to go into what can be the conversion from a percent to weight, and then conversely from weight back to percent. So as you'll see as the video unfolds. But as of right now, let's just say a basic formula, as we have done in previous videos. You have 100% flour. Okay, generally it's going to be a bread flour, a white flour. So let's just keep it at one single flour at 100%. And then let's say you have 65% water. Okay, so that's going to be a moderate level to a higher level of hydration, okay, which is going to be the majority of most of the breads that you'll make. So 100% flour, 65% water. Then salt. Salt generally is 2% across almost all breads. A very consistent and let's say effective range would be 1.8% to 2.2% salt. It's very, very uncommon for it to be outside of those ranges. All right. So today we're going to go 100% flour, 65% water, 2% salt, and now yeast. And this is going to be just a commercial yeast. It could be instant or dry active, compressed yeast, whatever it is that you have. But today we're going to go with an instant yeast. And as I said, it doesn't really matter what yeast right now. But I'm going to say at 0.7%, so 0.7%. So our total formula, 100% flour, 65% water, 2% salt, and 0.7% yeast, all right? And when you have those in line, flour, water, salt, yeast, okay, draw a line underneath it, and you add up the total of those percentages. Those percentages will add up to 167.7%. So that becomes your formula. You can make the same exact bread every single day. It'll pretty much always, if you maintain consistent process, this will create the exact same bread every single day. That way you're not just like in cooking, adding a little extra this, a little, taking a little bit away from that. That's why there's a difference between what has been referenced as a recipe versus a formula. Formula is 100% against ratios. A recipe is a way to kind of give you an idea of what you want to do, but you can change it as needed, right? So these are going to be called formulas, right? We now have 167.7% total parts to this bread formula. And I want to specifically say it as parts, all right? So, as I said, there's going to be 100 parts flour, 65% or 65 parts of water, 2 parts of salt, and 0.7 parts of yeast. Now imagine that you want to make 10 pounds of dough and or 100 pounds of dough, or you want to make, according to how many pieces you want to make, and you want to scale them at a certain weight. If you were to make, say, 2 round loaves just for your home baking, and you want them to be 1.5 pounds, okay, so you would now have 3 pounds of dough, okay, and or as I mentioned, 10 pounds or 20 pounds or 100 pounds. You can scale it any way you want, and that's the reason we make these types of formulas. If you were to do it as such, all you need to do, and I'm just going to use it as a base of 10, okay, so if you were to take the 10 pounds that you want to create, divide it by the total amount of parts, that 167.7. So you're going to take 10 divided by 167.7, and that is going to equal a 0. All right? Once you've got that number, multiply that by the amount of parts that you have. So just for flour, 10 divided by 167.7, multiply that by the 100 parts, okay? Because that decimal point, that decimal quotient, is actually what each individual part is going to be considered, right? So 10 divided by 167.7 times 100 parts of flour equals the total amount and weight of flour. You do that again for water. So total amount of dough weight, 10 pounds, divided by 167.7, multiply that by the 65 parts of water. That will then equal X, all right? Then you go into the salt, then you go into the yeast, the exact same thing. It's a very, very simple way to go through it, and as long as you just remember that very simple sequence, total parts divided by the weight, the weight divided by the total parts multiplied by each individual part. It's as simple as that. That would be what I would call a simple, basic math formulation for baker's percent. Thank you. So we went from percent to weight, and we took a 10-pound total dough weight, divided it into the equal parts that was at 165, 2%, and then the 0.7 on the yeast. So now if you were to do the opposite of that, in other words, take an existing recipe perhaps or formula that you may already have, and then you want to actually create the percentages for that so that you can basically recreate it and be consistent about it. It's a very similar process, just basically the opposite. We first have to establish what is the weight of each individual one. So if it was a recipe, okay, and you did cups or you did different measurements, take what those are when you've made it, actually scale off those ingredients and write them down so you know exactly how much the flour was, how much the water was, how much the salt was, and how much the yeast was. Once you have that, and now you've got those broken down into those 4 parts, and you want to create a percentage to be consistent when you have to make this a second time or more, then once you have the flour weight, you always know that the flour weight is going to also equal 100%. So you have your one consistent. That one consistent, let's say it was 10 pounds of flour, just to be simple. If the 10 pounds of flour equals now 100%, then the water, if let's say the water weighed, let's say 6 pounds, okay, just as a nice easy round number. If the 6 pounds and 10 pounds of flour, and you now want to create the percentage of what that is, just merely take the 6, divide it by the 10, multiply it by 100, you've now got your percent, which would be 60. You will then do the same with the salt and with the yeast, okay? So divide the salt weight, divide that into the weight of the flour, then multiply that times 100. The same with the yeast. Divide the yeast weight, divide it into the weight of the flour, multiply by 100, and now you have your percentages. okay? Once you have those total percentages, there's no reason that you won't be able to recreate the exact same bread that you did the first time, all right? Have you ever been in a position where you made it really, really good one day, and then all of a sudden you tried to make it a second time, and procedure, everything else, temperatures were all the same, but for some reason it just didn't look the same or be the same? Very likely that one of those measurements was off, but now that you've got it created into a percentage, you will have no reason to. So if you have a good scale, if we've used in the past, and now you have the percentage, that consistency of the hydration of the flour, the amount of salt that went into it, the amount of yeast, all of those will be always consistent. Now you just have to maintain proper dough temperature, proper procedure, room temperatures and such. Once you have that, then you now have been able to take from an existing formula or recipe, create it into the percentage, and now once you have the percentage, it's all consistent. So from that point on, you now have that. So now we have the basic understanding of what a simple baker's percentage formula looks like, how you would produce the math for it, how you create both the weights and the percentages. Now, if we were to take this a step further, and we've done in past episodes where we've made a pre ferment, okay, which we made a poolish baguette. And if we were to make that poolish baguette, but you want to actually create it from your own formula that you've already made, you can pull a percentage of flour out of an original formula and then create that pre ferment. And I just want to go through the explanation of what it is and how you would actually go about that. All right, so if you have a very basic formula as we had before, 100% flour, 65% water, 2% salt, let's say 0.5% yeast. Now, if you want to pull and make a pre-ferment, you're going to be pulling a percentage of flour and then a percentage of water out, all right, and a small little bit of yeast. Then you're going to subtract those from the total. So if you're now going to consider from that 100% of flour, how much you actually want to ferment, all right? So you're going to think of a percentage. Generally, it's about 20 or 30%, even up to 40% of the total flour that you're now going to ferment. So if we were to take, just on a simple thing, 20% flour, all right? So let's say you had 10 pounds of total flour, multiply that by 20%, that now means that you're going to take 2 pounds of that flour and take it out of the total flour, all right? If it's going to be a poolish, which we did in making baguettes, a poolish, as you remember, is only going to be the same amount of water as the same amount of flour, okay? So it's, now we're again at almost a small mini formula, which is going to be 2 pounds of flour, which will now be 2 pounds of water. Put a percent next to it. So it's 100 pounds of flour, and now 100% flour and 100% water, all right? For a poolish or anything of a pre-ferment that you may, there's going to be a certain percentage of yeast. That's going to be dictated by the length of time that you want to actually ferment that pre-ferment. Most likely you're going to be doing it overnight, and on the attachments later from the website that I'll link you to, I'll explain a little bit more into how much you might want to do. But if you're to just do it simply overnight, you're going to use an extremely small amount of yeast and let it ferment at room temperature overnight, which would be about 0.1%. All right. So if you now have 2 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of water, and then 0.1% yeast, which is honestly just a little pinch, you'd have to subtract that now from the original formula. So 10 minus 2 equals 8. All right. So you're now going to have 8 pounds of flour. Let's say you had 6 pounds of water minus 2. It's now going to be 4 pounds of water. All right. Then the same amount of salt that you had in the original, it's going to be moved over. And then the amount of yeast that you would have used for that pre-ferment is now going to be subtracted also from the total yeast that you had. So let's just consider it this way. You've made 2 separate formulas that are now going to combine. One is going to be added to the final dough, and then you're going to mix and make your dough. So your poolish is going to be 2 pounds of water, 2 pounds of flour, a little pinch of yeast, let it ferment overnight. You now have the remaining left of what that original formula was, which is the 8 pounds, the 4 pounds of water, the remaining salt, and the remaining yeast. Okay, that's the second part. All right, ferment the pre-ferment. The next day, scale off the rest of those dry ingredients, add the water, add the poolish, mix your dough. Well, now you've got your total dough. All right. As I said, it's relatively simple to go through this. You can change the percentage of the amount of flour. So if you want to do this with a higher percentage, 30 or 40%, or if you wanted to not make a poolish and you wanted to make what we call a biga, which is a firmer pre-ferment, it gives a little different acidity level to it. That means that you would just go, instead of the 2 pounds of water, you're now going to consider, let's say, 60% or 70% water, even 50% water against that 2 pounds of flour that you've taken out. So that would be, let's say, if you just did it at 50% for easy math, the 2 pounds of flour, 1 pound of water, the remaining yeast, the yeast that you would have drawn out of it, let that ferment overnight, and then it's actually just going to be 8 pounds of flour, just the 1 pound out of the water, so it would now be at 5 pounds, whatever it is, okay? And it's just going to be a simple way for you to start thinking about how you may want to create your own formulas, your own breads, and play with the flavor profiles that are going to come. Because in future episodes, what I do want to do is one very specific episode that is going to be, in that episode, actually creating a formula and making a bread from that formula. Just by mixing and matching, trying different flours, maybe using a fat, maybe different pre-ferments. You can combine it with multiple pre-ferments, and then even a sour, which we'll also be doing on these episodes. But I just wanted to give you that brief overall explanation of what baker's percent is, because that is the absolute foundation for everything that a baker does. If he doesn't understand it, his consistency to create the same product each and every day is almost insurmountable. So once you do have everything in a percentage, it becomes much easier. It's very easy to transfer that into an Excel formula that you can make into a spreadsheet that can be created for anything that you want to do. I keep them on the computer even for home purposes, just because you can pull it up, print it. It's very simple. If I need to make more for a party or something more, I will increase the amount of dough weight or whatever it is that I'm making, and it's still going to be consistent with what I would have made when it was smaller. So I hope you understand this. It's really not that hard. And just thinking about it as a simple, basic foundation to baker's percent in baking. It does get more complex when we talk about adding a sourdough, but I will do that in another episode as well. But I thought this would be enough for us to talk about today. So thank you again. I would like to ask you again, if you do enjoy these videos, that subscribe to the channel that you're watching right now on YouTube. And if you would also like to, you can go to our website, which is kingdombread-tampa.com, and follow us on there as well. There's plenty of references there, as well as much of the uploaded videos. Thank you.